Good morning, everybody. Oh, I'll say that again. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming, those in person and those online. I'm Catherine Rafelson. I have neglected to put my phone on silent. Sorry about that. I'm the president of SID-US, and I'm so happy to welcome you today to our event on a book launch. The event is called, we're launching 2 books today. Well, we're not launching them, but we're discussing 2 books today, and the topic of our event is International Development, Past, Present, and Future. I just want to make sure everyone online can hear. If you cannot, please let us know in the chat, and our folks will help with that. So today we're going to be talking to authors of 2 books exploring the history, challenges, and future of international development. There'll be a book signing after the event for those who are here in person, so I hope you can stick around. We have a couple of slides, and I can't actually see the slides. They are behind me. So next slide, please. We just want to mention that the views today and opinions expressed by our speakers are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, and positions of SID-US. SID-US does not endorse any specific perspectives, strategies, or advice shared during this session. Other things to note for our online audience, a couple of comments. Well, for everybody, this session will be recorded and shared. Closed captioning for those online can be accessed through your individual Zoom settings. And please post your questions for the speakers in the chat and note if it's for a specific speaker. We may not be able to get to every single question, but we will certainly try. Today's event is co-hosted with the Global Center for Innovation and Learning and UNA-NCA, the United Nations Association for the National Capital Area. And I want to give a special shout out and thanks to Shakil Malik for coming to us with this idea for this event and helping to make it happen, and for providing some really delicious samosas for those who are here in person. If you haven't had one yet, please, feel free to get one at any time, and also after the event. Shakil is the co-founder and CEO of the Global Center for Innovation and Learning, which is also GCFIL. It's a woman-owned minority small business in the U.S. with a local presence in Tanzania, Bangladesh, and Uzbekistan. They provide professional development programs aimed at building human capacity and improving lives through education and innovation. They also have expertise in business development, event management, organized trainings, workshops, conferences, and special events for global clients. I also want to thank UNA-NCA. They're a great partner to SID-US, and in fact, we share space here with them in DC. UNA-NCA builds and connects global citizens in Maryland, Washington, DC, Northern Virginia, and beyond through advocacy, outreach, education, networking, and its direct connection to the UN. They started in 1952 to advance the mission and ideals of the UN and are one of the oldest and largest chapters of the UNA-USA. UNA-NCA holds many events and programs, publishes blogs, and more to support their advocacy efforts, education, outreach, and networking. Then SID-US, most of you know us. SID-US stands for the Society for International Development US chapter. Like UNA-NCA, we've been around since the 50s. We're a membership association focused on networking and information sharing for international development organizations and individuals spanning all sectors. Our members hail from NGOs, for-profits, consulting firms, the private sector, universities, government agencies, embassies, think tanks, you name it. We hold many events and provide opportunities for members and the broader community to connect with each other, with donors, partners, employers, employees, etc. For those who aren't members, we're offering a special discount, 50% off. I have no idea how you get that, but
for people who have attended the event online
today, just contact us. Let us know you attended. Yes, I always forget to get those details. Most of our members have been hit hard by the drastic cuts to foreign assistance this year. As you can imagine, you are among those, most of you, I assume. And as a result, we are pivoting our programs and our attention to try to address the new needs of our community. To do this, we are all trying to figure out the way forward and what the future of international development will look like. So this event, looking back at the past and the present and looking towards the future, is extremely timely. And I think these two books will really help inform all of us as we try to figure out the way forward in a really unprecedented moment. So with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ann Simmons-Benton, who has been involved with SID-US for a very long time, as long as I can remember. She is the deputy chair of our board and oversees our membership committee, among other things. She's been chair of our annual conference at least twice and has also been involved in our strategic planning and other initiatives. She's on our executive committee. In addition, she is the chair of the board of our co-host, UNA-NCA. She is also the co-head of the U.S. delegation to the W20, an engagement group of the G20 that provides a transnational network to bring together women leaders of civil society, businesses, entrepreneurship ventures, and think tanks. She provides expertise across working groups focused on entrepreneurship, financial inclusion, labor, and digital inclusion to ensure that women's issues are included in the G20 agenda. And she's also principal at Deepwater Point LLC. Anne has worked for USAID, Arizona State University, DAI, Booz Allen, the State Department, and more. So she, like Sid, spans all sectors. Her work she's also a lawyer, which comes in handy and sometimes not. Helps keep us in line. Her work in such a broad range of sectors gives her a unique perspective that is very, very valuable to SID-US, since we also work in a broad range of sectors. And it positions her well to think about international development in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anne to introduce our speakers and set the stage for today's event.
Thank you, Catherine. And I'm going to turn off the microphone because I understand online they hear us better. But if we get a little quiet in the room, you just raise your hand and let us know. And thank you for that lovely introduction. I would like to share that with my granddaughter, who's 12, who's visiting and just thinks I'm annoying. And with that, I'd like to welcome Mira and Theo, Michael Gubser's children. One of the great things about the meeting today and the books is they last beyond us. And when we think about all the developments going on now, thinking about the next generation and preparing them to think about this, to me, is one of the hopeful things. I would like to, a little bit like Catherine, start our discussion by honoring all those who have been involved in international development, whether at the government level, at the implementer, contractor level, whether in NGOs, people who worked in every single thing, whether they did communications or operations or invoices. The plethora of people overseas, whether FSNs, et cetera, have all been affected recently by all the changes. Our two authors here wrote their books before we knew what was going to happen with our sector. And so I just really want to let the people who are online and in person know that we feel your pain. We are with you. We are looking hopefully for the future. SID-US in particular is looking at preserving knowledge, keeping a community together. And so don't ever feel alone. We are together as long as we have each other. And I really want you all who are here and online to also share that message because it's an important time. So now what I would like to do is ask our authors, because to me, writing a book is also your story. And so instead of me reading their bios, I would like to ask them to each introduce themselves, tell about their background, and then to let us know how that led to them come about writing this particular book. Michael, if we can start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Anne, for helping to organize and to MC this event and to moderate it. Thank you to all of you who came in person and online, and thank you to the sponsors who made this possible. I'll also thank my children who have tolerated coming here, Theo and Mira, who are in the back of the room. Yeah, to introduce myself. So I am, to begin simply, I mean, I'm a professor of history at James Madison University, which is in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, about 2 hours from Washington, D.C., although I live in the D.C. area as in Northern Virginia, as my wife is a professor at Howard, and so we're in between. My training is actually very odd to be writing a book like this. I was trained as a modern European historian, so 19th and 20th century Europe. So at JMU, I teach classes on the Holocaust, East Europe under communism, and the like. However, after getting my PhD and prior to getting into academics, I went through a period of very fruitful academic unemployment, where, among other things, I worked for an international development contractor here in Washington, D.C. In fact, the person who hired me, who is here in the front row, is Gerald Kielsen, is one of the only people I have ever met in international development who had a background in historical studies. And so that's one of the sources of the book. I mean, this was in 2003 when I was hired. And I can say, actually, it was really on one day, it was Tuesday, late August, I'm not going to remember the precise date, when I came in for orientation and was showed around. I was freshly minted history PhD. Little did I know how unusual it was. And I was being shown in the office, and I recall asking someone, let's say I'm going to write a proposal about schools in Morocco. Where do I go to find the history of schools in Morocco? And I recall absolutely vividly, I got laughed at. And I remember, wrinkling up my brow. What? And someone said, well, there might be some documents online, CIA things or others. I thought, oh, that was the birth of a project, right? And this book that I wrote is an attempt to write the history of why development has been a primarily ahistorical discipline. That is, why development practices, and we're talking now for 75 years. Really, I started in the middle of World War II and just after World War II and go forward, and why development was primarily technical and paid often little attention to the history of the societies where they worked or the history of their own profession. This is over decades. And so I attempt to write that. And what I found is that there are many different ways to ignore history, in fact. And so I write the history of how development professionals often overlooked history. But that was very personal because of my experience. And I don't want to put this on one person. I myself, when I got very busy and focused on deadlines, jetted off to countries paying no attention to anything but what the recent incumbent on a particular project was doing, looking no further back than 2 or 3 years, right? I've since, returning to academics, in addition to teaching European history, I now teach the history of international development, and I continued consulting both as a proposal writer and then as a program evaluator. And in that capacity, I've continued to straddle both the academic and the development practitioner field, and what felt like the very present-oriented and future-oriented field of development, and my own interests in history. I'll stop there and turn to Sam because a lot of these will.
Thank you. Sam.
Well, thank you. And just also really want to start with just acknowledging all the people who've gone through the sort of trauma that's hit this community as it's been dismantled in many ways, and abruptly dismantled in a way that was neither professional, but at the same time, in essence, not recognizing what was happening and what was being done. My book does sort of tell a story. By the time I was 20, I lived in 5 countries on 3 continents. I guess they called you a third culture kid at that point. It didn't exist. I ended up eventually with a Fulbright in Geneva on an organization at the ILO, a place called Participatory Organizations of the Rural Poor. So this idea of the voice of local agency, of the voice of local change was sort of driving me at that point. And I ended up being fortunate of spending 28 years in leadership positions in the NGO sector. And part of that was we're here at the Plan USA office. I was the president and CEO of Plan USA for 13 years there, and then spent 16 years leading Interaction, which was the largest sort of global alliance of NGOs. And what I realized, I had an opportunity about 10 years ago. There was a short sabbatical I had.
A little louder.
A short sabbatical I had about 10 years ago, and where I went to Bellagio at the Rockefeller Foundation, and I took a look at, well, where was this sector going? I knew hundreds of organizations and CEOs and what they're individually doing and seeing all the diversity of what people were up to, but where was it going and where did it need to change and what did it need to evolve into to be have more impact in the world? And I'd actually changed the mission of Interaction away from supporting these organizations to supporting their missions. It wasn't about them, it was about what they did in the world and could we have a greater impact in the world in doing this. I sort of got some good ideas of where we were headed as a sector, wrote some ideas out there. This was 10 years ago, and then realized there's a broader story to tell here of what do these organizations do? Why do they exist? What purpose do they serve? How can they change themselves? How are they led? How do they relate? What power do they have? What change do they make possible in the world? And I think I had a colleague, a friend at Harvard who looked at Sam, this is a book here. You cannot do this in a month at Bellagio. But I started a process of going, actually, I have a book that I want to write. And so 2 years ago, when I retired into the world of non-gainful employment, I've then spent the past 2 years writing a book to this community, recognizing that it's a person's perspective. But it's a perspective where I had stories that I'd collected and brought back written over 30 years, time in Darfur, time in Gaza, pick your dangerous place. A lot of them have been to, but also stories that captured the power of individuals around the world to change the world. And the whole concept of prisoner of hope, which I'll come back to, is this idea. People ask me, why on earth are you still optimistic about humanity's prospects, given all that is happening in the world? And the answer is, I am, because of humanity. And we could get into that. This book could be read by different chapters, localization, pick your topic. It is an effort by a professional of many years in the field to tell the narrative of who we are and what we should become. And I had the fortune of a publisher going, we're not quite finished, we need to do this right. And then all of a sudden it's March and I get to rewrite the ending of this whole thing. And what is being dismantled and what does it mean that it's being dismantled? And if it needs to be rebuilt, how does it need to be rebuilt?
Can I just
Yes,
add
please.
to that? So my book was completed and finished and off of the publisher long before the current administration. But so I didn't have the luxury that Sam did of adding anything in here. But for those interested, I did have an editorial that just came out on Yale University Press that entitled "The Crisis of International Development Today." So for my sort of thoughts on it in light of this book that I came out, it is. So if you look at Yale University Press and my name, you'll find that.
Yeah, and that'll be one of the questions I asked you.
Okay.
But one other one I wanted to really start with still is the author's journey here. Because a lot of people in our industry really want to write books and not everyone was able to get them done. I was lucky to take a course at Arizona State University with Mr. Gutkind, who wrote a book about how do you write a book about this. How do you can't make it up is what it's called. And he said the biggest problem he has is people who come to him, they can't finish the book. They get stuck. They have an idea. They write the first chapter. So I always think, ever since I was in that class, one of the things I want to know is, okay, we heard your story. We heard why you want to write it, but how did you finish it? How did you get through? How did you persevere? So Sam, I'll start with you this time.
I wasn't sure I was going to make it through. I mean, that just to be candid, and I said 2 years of writing. I'm talking about 2 years of doing this. And the challenge I had is I've been taking notes. You know, you go to an interesting place and you come back and you capture that experience from that period in time. So I had notes that were dated in a sense, largely from places around the world. And then since I had my role both at Plan and at Interaction, I had a talking head role, a spokesperson. So I wrote endless speeches and things. Okay, so I've got a lot of writing that I have here. Can I pull this into something? And so I started pulling it together, realized I have too much material and does it hold together? And what's the narrative of this? And finally drafted a few, for first chapter and sent it to a friend who was actually the editor of the LA Times here in DC. I got brought back to earth as to what this was. And it was sort of a clear message of, well, who is your audience? And do you have a clarity in the audience? And put yourself in this. And I'm like, wow, wait a second. I've got all this stuff. I understand, but no, you have to make it a narrative about a journey of your own learning without making it about myself. And I was fortunate to get an editor from someone, Shireen Jakasharama, originally from Sri Lanka, who could sort of push back on the sort of northern voice that was coming through this, but to find the appropriate voice to get through that, and then to eventually break it down into chapters that were standalone pieces. This is what I understand about the humanitarian sector. This is what going local means to me, and then cutting and cutting and cutting. So it was a long journey of writing. I also found, as someone who was writing rather dry speeches and so forth, that your writing changes as you go through a book like this. It becomes, I found it being clearer. I had to sort of, am I actually know what I am saying here? Am I articulating in a way? And can I make these stories interesting so that anyone who could sort of read the New York Times could read this without any of the jargon of the field? And so that I put myself a big challenge, and it finally got there. And I think the last bit was just sort of stubbornness of, I better finish this because I've been telling so many people that I'm writing a book that I need to pull it off at some point.
Thank you. And I think that jargon is so important to be able to write it so that people understand. So Michael, what about you?
Yeah, well, so I'm in a different situation, I guess, in that while being a practitioner, I'm also an academic. And so as a result, writing books is part of my job description, and I don't get to stay in my job unless I write books. So there is a certain incentive in that regard. But so two things. One, I think your point about lots of development practitioners wanting to write a book is an important one. And let me say that in a previous book that I edited with Gerald, and I have it here, it's called The Practice of International Development. One of the premises that we decided upon in writing it is that development practitioners have all sorts of thoughts about ethics and history and broader questions that they rarely have time to grapple with in the day-to-day deadlines and technicalities of implementation. And so we thought that providing an edited volume where instead of writing a book, practitioners could write essays, which is of course a shorter commitment, would allow them to step back from day-to-day practice and reflect on broader themes. And so that was the aim of this. So we were acutely, and we are, and I am acutely aware of the fact that there are broader stories to tell, that the deadlines and implementation and managerial requirements of aid often don't facilitate. And I think those broader stories are really, really important to tell. So I applaud Sam and other practitioners who are able to do this. So what was different about this book for me, and what was the challenge, is that I was moving from my field of European history into something that I was not technically trained in an academic sense for, right? But I had a lot of practitioner experience. And I committed in this book to, so one way to write a book, and I think it's the only way, to just think chapter by chapter by chapter. A chapter is a goal, a chapter is an accomplishment, right? Because a book is seems infinitely long. And unfortunately, given all the deadlines of life, the deadlines of a book are infinitely flexible too. So unless you chunk it, it's hard. The chapters in this, and this was new for me, I'm used to writing about theories. So my previous books have been about theories and philosophies and the like. And there are chapters in here that are about economic theories of development, modernization theory, dependency theory, and the like. But as a practitioner, I was also very aware that a lot of the history of development occurs in projects on the ground with implementers and managers. And so I have other chapters that looked at particular projects in various countries. So in particular here, in Guatemala, in Zambia, and in Bangladesh. And I wanted to write a book that wasn't focused on only one country, because my sense is that the audience would therefore be only those interested in that country. So I wanted to tell a story of development, not of Guatemala per se, although Guatemala factors into it. Figuring out that process for me was hard, and it was this trial and error of drawing not just on my academic training, but on training that I had done in development for proposal writing. How do I do interviews that get information? How do I get people to talk about the past? I recall, so there were earlier case studies that came out as articles as I was learning this craft in Uganda and in Zambia. And I recall speaking to one minister in Uganda asking about a project that had been closed 15 years earlier. And I was coming in now with training in researching proposals, but now as a researcher funded by a university. And I recall asking him to speak about these projects, and he looked at me and said, "Why do you want to know about that? That's ancient history." And I sort of laughed and said, "Indulge me." And it turns out he had a lot of exciting things and interesting things to say about it. And there were less political constraints in speaking about this project because it had closed 15 years ago. But it required surmounting this sense that, the past is the past, who cares? And so what I found, that was the challenging part. It was also the exciting, right? So I would do research, for instance, in Zambia, come back and try to corral all the information. And then the rhythm of the book, I could say, all right, next I'm going to look at understanding of history and dependency theory, where I can just rely on theories and stay home for a while and do this. And then I'll sort of summon up the energy to go to Bangladesh and sort of try this other set. So it was a book that required me to use many different methods to try to get information and to draw in sort of local voices. And that was both the challenge that drew it out for a long time, but also the excitement that kept me going.
I think those are great comments. I think one of the things about international development, when you talk about history and change, is that it is happening on the ground. It is not always written down. It is incredibly dynamic. And the fact that we are asking the truth, what really happened in those projects, and did it go well? If not, why? And then how can we do better? And what's the current situation? So it is a very dynamic topic. So your books are both really beautiful, and they're both very large. So, and I would say they can be read through just, one at a time. You can read them back to back, as I was doing, trying to get prepared for this. Or you can look at individual chapters. So as the authors here, I want you to sort of pick out three things that that these potential readers must focus on, and that our audience here will be enticed by in looking at your book. So, all right. Michael, would you like to go first? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I'll focus on the big themes. I mean, the first is, given my background, it's self-justificatory, right? History matters, right? I am, as you will see for those who look at the editorial on the Yale page, I'm deeply concerned and frustrated by the current moment, but also I hope it is an interlude, and it's a time where we can take stock of recalling strengths and weaknesses of development as it has been practiced in the past, with an eye for development going forward. I mean, the book is titled They are future, and yet it's a history, which is seemingly paradoxical. But I fundamentally believe that to make sense of where we are going, we have to understand the past, right? I mean, people move into the future by tapping their experience, which is history. That sounds cliche, that sounds banal, and it's hard to disagree with it. But again, given my experience, even myself, a trained historian, jetted off to places to look at projects without looking backward more than a year or two. So it is common practice. It's also one thing to say that you want to take history into account, and it's another thing to ask, how on earth do we do that? What does that mean? Do we read history books? Do we ask specific types of questions of interlocutors? And so one thing, this book chronicles the history of the lack of history. It ends with an open question that I hope the development community can take into account. What would it mean to think historically when we're designing projects and managing projects and evaluating projects? In some ways, it's very simple. I mean, it leads to very, sort of very obvious different designs. If, for instance, schools in Kenya are poor but improving, you would have a very different project from if they're poor but deteriorating. But you actually have to look back 10 or 20 years to know that trajectory, right? So these kinds of things matter. So one thing is, I think, the importance of history. Two, I don't think there's one development community. I think there's many. And I often think the communities don't always communicate well. The ones I know best, because of my experience, are the academic community interested in development and development history and development theories, and the practitioner community. So academics often pay limited attention to the gray literature, the project reports, and the like that practitioners produce, sometimes dismissing them as just sort of bureaucratic exercises. And oftentimes practitioners, I think, pay little attention to the various theories and histories that are written by academics. And so I think bridging those communities is really crucial. And that's a second thing I hope to take away, that is a takeaway from the book. The third thing is that we talk a lot about localization. And localization and tapping local ideas, I think, is crucial. But there are many forms of localization, and there's ways to be ahistorically local, right? To be local and talk to local interlocutors, but ignore the past and treat a local place as if it is timeless, has existed always like this, right? And there are ways to be historical. One of the things that the case studies, as I went to Bangladesh or Guatemala or Zambia, taught me is that both among local practitioners and the wider community of Bangladeshis or Guatemalans who discuss development, there are rich literatures, rich ideas, rich histories that I think often go untapped as we race out to the field for 2 weeks to design a project or for 4 weeks to evaluate and talk to. I mean, it's absolutely essential to talk to ministers, to talk to, practitioners, but there are rich sources in archives, in books, some of which are easy to access and can be gotten before you go, that taps into a discourse that takes place in countries all over the globe where we're working. And I think the third thing is, trying to promote a localization that is rich and nuanced and historical in each of the communities and countries that we work in. So I guess those are my three big
I think
things.
you'll find some agreement in the community about localization from administration to administration in the US and being called different things. So, but let me turn to Sam and ask you your 3 things as well.
So again, I had slightly different audiences here. Some was the general public and students, and then some is this audience in this room. So I'll give some examples that meet the different audiences. But let me start with the audience that's not necessarily in this room. So I have there's a little piece, part of a chapter where I'm sort of in Zamzam camp in Darfur, and individuals living and working in Zamzam camp, and describing that. This is in 2007. Just the time was planned. Office in Pakistan was attacked, and we had staff killed. I was sort of operating in a complex zone. All right, fast forward to now, Zamzam camp is at the epicenter of the famine happening in Sudan. There you get that story of, okay, 2014, I think they let 3 people in right after the war there into Gaza. I was one of those 3 people coming in. You're sort of driving between the Hamas towers and the IDF on one side, and do they know who's in the car? And then time with people working and living in Gaza, local, who are running this, and then we know what Gaza is today. Okay, why did I start with this? Because the theme of the book is actually about hope. How on earth, Sam, can you talk about being hopeful about the world when you've been to these places and seen this and described this and so forth? And the concept that sort of Desmond Tutu takes out of this being a prisoner of hope is not being optimistic about the world and sort of a rose-colored world and so forth. Hope is imagining a different future for the world and acting on it, and taking the political will to shift that future to make some change happen in the most complex environment. And no matter how complex environment I've witnessed in the 30-some countries I cover in this book, there's always someone somewhere who is enabling and acting on improving a better future for their neighbors, for their community, and so forth. So that's the theme that goes through this. It's not a naive thing, because I certainly am very blunt about what I see and talk about, but it's a theme about change and why we as individuals have the power to make change. The book is in essence a call to action around that. The second point is, you remember in the 1990s going on is, what is the role of NGOs and where do you fit, and when you going out of business? No, you're not going out of business. Development is a global process that is going to exist. As long as there's globalized business in the world, there needs to be globalized development and learning, and it maybe needs to change in fundamental ways. But how these entities and what your roles are, and what are NGOs between those that have $1 billion of private money and operate somewhere and those that do aid grants or other grants and dip in and out. What is your role and how do you fit in this? And then ultimately, what is your voice? I remember it was a meeting with President Sarkozy. I was bilingual in French, invited there by the French NGO counterpart, and I asked the question, so GPA, why do you want to meet with us? Why, other than checking the box, I've met with civil society. Why? And his answer was an interesting one, because if we launch something globally and you say no and push against it, it doesn't get off the ground. And if we launch something globally as nation states and you join us and push with us, we can make massive change happen in the world. So here's a role, is a role of voice. So I'm going down to the role, down into the level at the project level, up into the voice, in a whole section on that. And then the last bit I sort of call a relevant future. And I have about a number of areas that sort of, where does this go? And this is a section that was sort of interesting to test by time, because I originally started writing it 10 years ago in Bellagio, finished it before the sort of Trump cuts and so forth, and then had another stab at it at the end. And I was able to find that actually the main themes were stayed pretty constant. We need to evolve our programs, very specific recommendations how those need to happen. We're going to be constantly holding governments and corporations to account. And how do we hold them to account? That needs to change. The concept of civic space, the space within which we operate to do our work, cannot be taken as a given, particularly in this era and time, and we need to protect that space. So ideas on how you protect that space. USAID used to have a development education program that Senator Jesse Helms shut down. We need to have a process of cultivating an informed public. What does that do? What does that mean? How do you keep that public going with you? And then here comes the idealism part. We're into promoting equitable societies. How do we promote those types of societies? And then the tough part to us is, what does this mean for our government? What is an inclusive form of governance for an NGO, a global NGO working across borders? What does that look like? What type of governance structures are it? I've been fortunate to be pulled into the governance structures of dozens of large organizations and seeing different attempts to deal with this. And then finally is recognize that we, as civil society aid developers here in the US, or as individual companies delivering programs and so forth for AID and other actors, we are part of global civil society. And we have to see ourselves as part of those networks. Do we spend time strengthening those networks, or are we just delivering our own projects? So I end with this sense of, here is a relevant future. And I think that will be sort of the interesting part for the practitioner, which is the last chapter of the book.
Can I add one thing? that I think taps what Sam was just saying about the relevant future. So I also speak to multiple communities, I mean, professional communities, not just development practitioners, but also historians. And one takeaway I think I want to emphasize is that too often, I think history is taught poorly as a set of facts that you have to memorize. And I think that does a disservice to history. History, in my understanding, and I try to make that case in this book, is a set of possibilities, some of which have come about, some of which are untapped. And it's often the untapped possibilities that are the most interesting. I mean, of course you have to memorize and you have to know certain facts, but history is a trove of human possibilities, development possibilities that we can tap. And that's where the future comes in, right? The future is often found in those possibilities in the past that never happened. And I should note that I consider development not a sort of niche topic, but in some ways, development is the whole of modern history. The British Industrial Revolution, what is that but a story of development? American industrialization, what is that but a story of development, right? I mean, development is the story of the modern world. In a way, what our industry changes is that in the 20th century, development becomes a process that we try to manage more explicitly. It was always international. British industrialization depended on slave trades and international trade, right? But it was less managed. So we have tried to manage it more. But far from being a niche topic, I think what development practitioners do is a topic of trying to push history in a more hopeful way. And that is one of the key stories of the modern world. So I hope it also shows that history is really a story of the future and a story of passions and a story of excitement that practitioners will embrace in that sense.
Well, one thing I think is that the international development sector and all the work that has been done by NGOs, by government, by contractors, et cetera, we did not really explain well to the U.S., to the average citizen. And maybe I'm particularly emotional right now about the floods in Texas, because I grew up in Texas. My little sister went to Camp Kickapoo in Kerrville, Texas. After my dad died, I had to drive her home. And for some reason, because my mother was weak after my dad died, she convinced her that we could bring a horse home. We did not have a big backyard, and we then had to figure out how to do it. But I still remember them telling me there are floods on the roads, and these are in the hills, and you have to be very careful. I'm like, but the horse is big and heavy. I'm 19, right? I'm like, I'm just, driving a station wagon. The horse is not. So I look at those little girls. I see those cabins. That's our early warning system. We learned from the U.S. how to do it. We put those principles into FuseNet for famine early warning systems. We put them into Central America for the hurricanes. And so I think now we're learning a lesson of why we did all those things and why they're important in international development. So
just echo on that, just had a little bit on this. I spent some time in sort of how does civil society evolve. I think one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century was the international civil society exploding around the world. So what were the key elements of that? And part of it was just human empathy worrying about what happened somewhere else. But that became then a global empathy as we had this. But that empathy was mixed with concepts of human rights and dignity.
Yeah.
And it was the combination of those three things of bringing concepts of human empathy with rights and dignity that created, in essence, what do we mean about the type of change we want to see in the world. So,
yeah, no, and Americans personally and individually are the biggest donors to that. So with the impetus of the dissolution of USAID and a lot of the grants and contracts being gone and moving over to the State Department, which has its own difficulties at the moment. Since your books were written before all this happened, are there key recommendations that you feel still hold? What can you talk to about that?
The joy of not having a big job with a lot of people responsible is you can just sort of be blunt sometimes and talk about it. I mean, there's certain things that we don't need to do. I mean, it's been interesting Our government's been very vocal about localization and what that means and so forth. But it is very hard to shift power on a dollar that's accountable to an American taxpayer and Congress. And you're putting the intermediary in this bind of sort of like you're saying you must do one thing, but you're not actually giving up power. And so one of the realities is, I think if we're going forward, do we actually have a space for appropriate localization of resources? And what do we mean by that? Maybe it's direct funding and so forth. But let's not put entities in this bind of we expect you to be accountable to them and go local at the same time. So I think that's just one thing of a lesson there. We can, however, go local with other forms of resources. I mean, Interaction was what, $15.4 billion of membership resources when I left. Only 24% of that was US government. All the rest, you could go much more local. And when you're power and shift, you could change your behavior of how you're controlling your own resources as it relates to local actors. Tough to do, but you can make those types of changes. But I think what we're looking at here is we're able to ideally someday rebuild this from scratch. And to me, it's taking the areas of things that work, different forms of technical expertise that are brought in, and how do you relate technical expertise to local knowledge and so forth, bringing in who has power and agency over the types of change that you're looking in different contexts. And recognizing that if you're doing it from the US government's perspective, this is always going to be mixed with US foreign policy and national interests as it's doing this. So we've commingled a lot of these things. We're commingling them more by pulling it into the State Department. We've dropped the idea that human dignity and human lives have value. And there's now, in essence, a cruelty that is happening, the latest, as ever by the Lancet of 14 million people dying in the next 10 years. Okay, that's roughly the horror of what Hitler caused in World War II. Of course, the two cannot be equated, but if you're a child who's dying, it's that many people are dying because this country adopted a policy that turned its way away from values. If we get back into this, and when we get back into this, we have to be centered on the values of human dignity. We have to be centered on the idea of Americans as an emotive people that respect others and that look at issues of rights and so forth. Yes, national security and so forth, but if we build an international development or a foreign engagement program without tying to the core values that got us into the first place, we might as well not build it again.
Before I let you answer that question, Michael, as the moderator, I just want to remind people we'll have a few minutes for questions. I'm not doing a very good job because I could talk to them for hours. But if you can formulate your questions, we'll online and in the room, we'll take a few after this answer. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the recommendations do still hold. I'll say 3 points on it. One, I do think it's important to have hope in this moment, sort of hope against hope, right? And optimism. And partly that is historical. Time passes and things change, and what looks bleak now would look different in the future. The example I used when we were talking online, how are we to evaluate the US's 20-year aid experiment in Afghanistan, or broad experiment? It may look bleak now. If in 20 years or 10 years, whatever, a new government comes into power that changes things and women are involved and they look back and say that, what I remember as a child in this school helped shape how I think in the future, it may look very different, right? The past changes all the time, and I don't think we yet know what the upshot of America's Afghanistan experiment is. And I don't think we yet know what the upshot of what's going on now is, let alone looking back over the 75 years of aid. So I think that kind of cultivating that kind of hope is important. Second, I do think collecting the history is important, again, because history is a set of possibilities, lessons to be learned and the like. I want to do a plug right now for an organization I'm involved with. So Gerald and I have founded what's called the Center for Development History.
Did you read the question? That's it. Sorry, that was my first question online. Please go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't read the question.
No, it's perfect.
Gerald and I
It's perfect.
founded something called the Center for Development History, which is sort of has homes in some universities. At my university, James Madison University.
Here shortly.
What?
I just gotta brush teeth and go.
Well, thank you. Someone is not on mute. Please brush your teeth well.
In any case, it has sort of two purposes. One is to collect oral histories from development practitioners, not only for commemorative purposes, but to raise a set of issues that future practitioners can take into account when they're developing programs. And second, to develop strategies for considering history in development practice. I would add a third thing. It's an attempt to bridge these development communities, in particular academics interested in development with practitioners. So I do think taking stock of that history is crucial going forward. The final thing, and I mentioned this in that editorial that I mentioned on the Yale page, for those going through this really difficult transition, I think it's important to note that the knowledge that you bring, not just of development, but of interacting with people from cultures vastly different is crucial. And I think an advocacy role for a US that is open to other cultures, open to other ways of doing things, open to learning from other cultures is crucial. Development has at times been very Westocentric. Here's what worked in the West, let's apply it in Bangladesh or Guatemala. But often practitioners in the field are engaged with locals, learning things, hearing things. They can't always put them in reports because there's no room, but that knowledge is critical now. I don't know if it's welcome in the halls of power. I can say it's certainly welcome among students in high schools and universities who planned on careers in development or foreign policy that now feel despondent about this and would like to hear about this, some of whom have families in other places and would like to hear about openness. It is crucial for people who want to imagine a US that is open to engaging with others. So I think that advocacy role, though it probably isn't going to pay really well now, is crucial at the moment and essential going forward, both to revive the aid industry and to think of new ways to do aid. So.
Well, thank you. That was a question from Alina online that you have just answered very well on the Center for Development History.
I meant to sort of bring Gerald into this, but maybe it's a little hard to do it. Yeah, we advocate afterwards.
Okay. So I see a hand in the room. If you would introduce yourself, your organization, if you have one.
My name's Laura and I'm with Hiring Coach, which is an AI organization that can help everybody in this room who wants to get a new job. If your question is actually about, so we exist because of market failure, a lot of the NGOs. And so I don't see the solution being the private sector. Everybody says, oh, we all just need to incorporate what we do into the private sector. But I don't see that as a complete solution. And I don't want to turn my back completely on government because government is the biggest financer, right? And I know that in the United States, a lot of people have, and I know that Reagan sort of set the stage and said, government's not the solution, government's the problem. And since those days, we've been talking about how government screws things up and is the problem. But I wonder if you've seen examples overseas where government is the solution and people are rallying to that. And we can draw some lessons from that on how to change the mindset of Americans so that they feel more hopeful about government.
Okay. And put your information in the chat when you get time and send it in, and we're glad to share that. So if you can combine maybe that question about influence overseas with how damaged is the dismantling of US aid to American influence in the world? And because we're getting close to time, and then I'll let you have concluding remarks. So thank you for that.
So I spent some time on sort of global NGOs in this, which goes beyond the US context. I'll go to Plan where I worked, where the Plan office here, Plan's a €1 billion NGO. US government shutting down's 4% hit. So it's not as if this is stopping the global NGOs. I worry they're going to get bigger and bigger, just like multinationals, that they're going to keep on growing, the big brands out there, the World Vision, Save the Children, and so forth. will keep on growing, and we're missing the middle of the market, our market, and the diversity of the market and the energy that comes out of it. All, I think, development ultimately is local. You're either rooted in communities at a community level, or you're in a tight partnership with local government and looking at where that government has troubles interfacing with its own communities, or you're working through government in terms of delivering programs. So there's, I spent time in philanthropy on boards of foundations, looking at how you, in essence, engage this partnership between civil society, business, and government at a local level. The US, for whatever reason, has more hangups on this sort of relationship that it has to be one way or the other, rather than sort of looking at what works in other countries. And an irony, I sort of there's one chapter I have looking at Brazil and massive influx of refugees coming in from Venezuela I was up on the border near Venezuela and Brazil. Bolsonaro is in power. The military is there. What are they doing? They're getting out Social Security cards and health benefit cards for every Venezuelan who comes in, tying them with local civil society groups so they could go and to find jobs to help grow the future of the country, because the future is ahead of us, not behind us. And so they're doing exactly the opposite of what US is doing, because they are in essence in this. And I think this is our challenge with the US role in the world. We're looking backwards as if we've had our heyday. We're not looking at a future where we could build a better future with others. And if you want to be an influential power in the world, and if the US is going to play that role and rebuild the trust that's been shattered because of this administration, we will need to engage and partner with others in the building of their own dreams and their own possibilities and their own profits and their own government deliverables and so forth. We've stood for that as a country before, and we need to stand for that as a country again.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think it's a choice between government or private sector. It's both, and it depends on the government, depends on the private sector, it depends on the country. Many of you will remember from the mid-2000s this very heated debate between Jeffrey Sachs and William Easterly about whether planning and government planning was the way to promote development or whether it was private initiative. And there's a bit at the end of the book where I say, the striking thing about this unresolved debate is that it doesn't feel like it needs to be resolved for me. Why does it have to be one or the other? And I discussed this a little bit also in some of the case studies. In the Bangladesh case study, we tended in the West to take microfinance in Bangladesh as this story of just how brilliantly innovative the private sector was with Grameen Bank and BRAC. But if you look at what goes on, the government had also been heavily involved in microfinance in various ways. And so we took away a one-sided story to support, as you said, a very kind of West-centric anti-government initiative that came about with Reagan and Thatcher. Here, I think US history is really, really important. And realizing just how recent that mantra is. From the New Deal period, for Franklin Delano Roosevelt through the 70s, the government was seen as an essential part of the problem, making sure that big business was never able to get so out of control as it did in supposedly leading up to the Great Depression, right? Government was essential in providing security and social security. These government programs were embraced by Americans. There was a dramatic shift in the 20s and in the 70s, excuse me. And so I think going back just to the US's own story to realize that what we take as normal truth that government is bad is actually quite a recent view and was not even an American for many times. So I don't think it's one or the other.
Well, I'm going to say, I feel like the title of Sam's book, building on the Desmond Tutu quote, Prisoner of Hope. I personally feel like I'm a prisoner of hope. I feel like learning from the NGO history, learning from the ahistorical approach to development, and having a pause, even though it's a pause I didn't want and our industry didn't want, that maybe we have a time to review. And SID, right after COVID, had a conference and the theme was mind the gap. What did we learn from the pause? And one of the things we did find out is localization was real, that countries advanced in an incredibly great way without intervention from foreigners, because everyone was locked in their place and things were. So, I'm hoping that with the insight of these books, with the time period we have, with holding our community dear and safe, that we can move forward. And at this point, even though I'd like to go a whole nother hour, I would like to thank our authors and panelists, Michael Gubser, Sam Worthington. I would like to thank UNA-NCA, my new favorite organization, which I don't know about that much yet, GCFIL, and the Center for Development History, which I look to see exciting things. And Shaquille, thank you again for your brilliance in suggesting our two authors. And to thank SID-US, who has been around since 1950, before I was born. I'm always glad when something's before I was born. And that we can really build together as a community. So I thank you who are here in the audience, that you cared to come, the people online, and to share the message that we do want to move forward. And I promised you one more word, but I don't know if our video is going to be cut off. Dan, could they have a concluding remark or?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you can have one concluding remark.
And this is a theme throughout the book, and it's local and so forth, but it's also a theme for us today and who we are in this period in time. And it's a thing about local agency and power and voice. That change comes from you, and you have power to make that change possible. And if someone can believe that and work in Gaza, and someone can believe that and work during the height of the AIDS pandemic in Africa, that they can make change, we here should be able to believe that we could make change and that we could have some form of agency and change the course of the history of this country as well. So that is my call to hope, is go back to your individual agency and the power, rather than saying, I can't do anything. You can.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that. That I see this as an interlude. Even if US aid is canceled, aid continues. And I think US involvement will continue, and that the future will afford possibilities for new trials, new ideas, new experiments that take account of not just what we in the US have done with foreign aid over the years, but also what we've learned by interacting with people in countries across the globe. So yes, I'm hopeful that this interlude is just that, an interlude.
And I think it speaks to the bigger community we have. Again, the South African theme for the G20 is Ubuntu, I am because you are. And I think if we hold that we alone, the US or whoever, doesn't have all the answers, but the individual agency, one-to-one, and working together, we can do more in the world. I think we can still hold hope. And with that, I will close our meeting today. Thank you so much. And join us for, if there are any samosas left, coffee, tea.
Thank you, Ann.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm gonna go up there and book sign and stuff, so we'll see you. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't have books to sign.
Sorry.
I mean, you just